Contrast. Episode 4, Beyond the Sky. In the previous episode, Viktor and Kateryna faced unexpected threats, are forced to accept a risky deal to escape, and are betrayed by a dangerous group. On the run, during a tense crossing, Viktor was injured, and together they overcame brutal attacks, ambushes, and deadly dangers, reaching physical and emotional limits in search of the freedom they dreamed of. In this pivotal episode, Viktor and Kateryna face a dramatic new challenge during a turbulent flight toward freedom. When they realize that the threat has not ended, and that the danger still pursues them even in the sky, they need to fight against fear and uncertainty to survive. But will they be able to escape, or will they be doomed to relive the nightmare they tried so hard to escape? Stay until the end of this electrifying episode to discover the final fate of Viktor and Kateryna. Follow every second of this intense journey and discover how the love story that resisted war, betrayal, and the most relentless dangers ends. The plane continued to shake with turbulence, and the metallic noise coming from the fuselage made Viktor remain alert. Kateryna looked at him, trying to read his serious expression. She knew he didn't trust coincidences, and the fact that the plane was unstable right after the chase didn't seem like something common. The cabin lights flashed intermittently and passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The pilot kept his voice firm as he reported that everything was under control, but Viktor knew that his confidence was not absolute. He noticed Kateryna pressing her fingers against the armrests of the chair, and without saying anything, she rested her hand on hers, conveying security, even though within herself, she also felt the weight of uncertainty. The wind cut through the windows, shaking the plane with each new gust, and the metallic clicks became more frequent. Viktor closed his eyes for a moment, trying to organize his thoughts. His body still carried the remains of his escape, but his mind was already analyzing possibilities. He didn't like to trust others to ensure his safety, and that plane was an element beyond his control. The pilot tried once again to reassure the cabin, explaining that they had probably hit an object on the runway, and that the impact did not compromise the aircraft structure. However, Viktor kept his eyes fixed on the corridor, watching for any sign that anything might go wrong. Kateryna noticed his concern and held his arm, whispering that they needed to believe that the worst was over. Time seemed to slow down as the plane moved through the sky. When a new fluctuation appeared, she made Viktor mentally calculate all the possible ways to get out of there safely in case something went wrong. His survival instinct never let him relax completely. Kateryna, on the other hand, was trying to hold her ground, seeking comfort in the idea that they were finally leaving everything behind. She looked out the window, seeing only the dark sky and the dim cabin lights reflecting off the glass. The pressure inside the plane was almost palpable, but no one dared question the pilot directly. Viktor knew there was still a long way to go until his final destination, and until then, he wouldn't let his guard down. The alarm sounded shrill, cutting off any glimmer of relief Viktor and Kateryna might have felt. Red lights flashed on the cockpit panel and the pilot pursed his lips as he studied the controls. The turbulence seemed to be getting worse, but the problem was different. He glanced quickly over the gauges and realized something was wrong with the fuel system. The damage had not been superficial. The part responsible for regulating fuel pressure had been hit, compromising engine stability. Viktor tightened the arms of the chair, feeling the tension growing with each second. Kateryna looked at him, trying to find some answer in the sharp and calculating look he always kept in dangerous situations. The pilot took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the instruments on the panel, trying to maintain control of the aircraft. The damage to the fuel system was serious, and if not repaired in time, the unstable pressure could cause the engine to fail mid-flight. He had no choice. He turned to Viktor, quickly assessing his condition. The man was exhausted, still carrying the weight of pain in his injured leg, but his expression left no room for hesitation. The pilot shouted that he would need someone to keep the aircraft stable while he made the repairs. Viktor didn't respond immediately, just got up with a restrained groan and took up position next to the control panel. Kateryna watched everything without saying a word, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes full of concern. Viktor, already in the co-pilot's seat, felt the weight of the situation fall on his shoulders. The pilot gave him quick instructions, showing him which controls he should monitor and how to adjust the aircraft's pitch if the balance was compromised during maintenance. He had never flown a plane before, but his analytical mind absorbed information quickly. The metal of the fuselage vibrated beneath his feet, and each sway of the jet felt like a reminder that any mistake could be fatal. They did a small simulation before Viktor took full control, moving the aircraft from side to side, going up and down, and then the pilot walked away, adjusting the safety equipment before leaving for the external compartment, where he would need to replace the damaged part. The internal radio crackled, as he announced that the repair would begin, and Viktor nodded, keeping his hands steady on the controls. The silence inside the cabin was broken only by the hum of the engines and the sound of the wind against the fuselage. Kateryna remained motionless, her eyes fixed on Viktor who, despite the pain and fatigue, kept his gaze fixed on the dashboard. Time seemed to move in slow motion as he followed the signals on the radar, waiting for any sudden movement that would require a correction. The radio crackled again, and the pilot's voice sounded muffled, informing him that the old part had already been removed and the new one was being fitted. Viktor felt a cold sweat run down his forehead. Any mistake now could cost the lives of everyone inside. Kateryna took a deep breath, feeling her chest tighten with the uncertainty of what would come next. That was when the aircraft was hit by a violent jolt, throwing Viktor against the back of the seat. The dashboard flashed with a new sequence of alerts, and the radio made an intermittent chirp, indicating that communication was unstable. He squeezed the stick hard, trying to correct the plane's pitch as the fuselage shook around him. The horizon wavered before his eyes, and an audible warning indicated that the altitude was falling too quickly. Outside, the clouds became choppy blurs, and the seconds without full control of the aircraft seemed like an eternity. Kateryna held on to the back of her armchair, her face pale but without looking away from him. The pilot shouted over the radio that he needed a few more minutes to complete the repair, which was almost over, his voice drowned out by the metallic cracks of the turbulence that threatened to tear apart the stability of the flight. Viktor took a deep breath, feeling sweat running down his temple, but his gaze remained fixed on the instruments. The survival instinct and coldness of someone who had already faced the impossible made him ignore the pain in his leg and the exhaustion. His hands adjusted the controls as the pilot had instructed, smoothing the aircraft's pitch in an attempt to stabilize it. In the corridor, passengers clung to their seats. Some murmured prayers, others kept their gaze fixed on any point, believing that focusing on something still could be the only way to preserve sanity in the midst of chaos. The plane swayed again, this time appearing to buckle under the weight of gravity. The altitude alarm flashed more brightly on the dashboard, and Viktor forced the stick up, feeling the resistance of the metal beneath his fingers. Kateryna closed her eyes for a moment, anticipating that this silent gesture might be the only way to avoid panic. The pilot's voice came back over the radio, breathless. He was almost done. Viktor had no choice. He needed to hold the plane in the air for a few more moments. Every muscle in his body screamed against the effort, but he maintained his position, controlling the abrupt descent with the little margin he had. The fuselage creaked, and for a moment it seemed as if the plane would break apart in the air. The seconds passed, and then a new signal on the dashboard indicated that the fuel pressure was stabilizing again. In the blink of an eye, when Viktor's strength and options were almost running out, the pilot hurriedly enters the cockpit, his hands dirty with grease and his breathing heavy from the effort. He slid into the main seat, taking control with a determined look as the instruments flashed before him. Moving the controls with precision, he adjusted the power of the engines and pulled the control stick, forcing the aircraft to regain altitude. The aircraft moved with great force, pinning everyone to their seats with overwhelming pressure. Then, the shrill noise of the alarms gradually diminished, replaced by the constant roar of the engines stabilizing the trajectory. The plane stopped shaking so violently, and the horizon became level again. The passengers, still clinging to the backs of their seats, began to relax their shoulders, absorbing the impact of what had just happened. On the next seat, Viktor slowly released the stick, his hands still shaking from the effort. He blinked a few times, trying to clear the adrenaline fog that was pounding in his head. His body finally sagged against the seat and a heavy sigh escaped his lips. The tension in his joints, the dull pain in his injured leg, the sweat running down his face, everything came at once, in a way that his body was only now realizing the wear and tear it had undergone. He passed his hand over his face, closing his eyes for a moment, hearing only the irregular breathing inside the cabin. There was no time to get lost in thought, but the certainty that he had passed yet another obstacle was firming up inside him. The plane no longer shook and the journey continued, still uncertain, but under control. The red lights on the dashboard went out one by one, until all that was left was the sound of radio static and the pilot's muffled voice informing them that they had returned to the correct course. Kateryna, sitting next to the booth, carefully observed every detail of Viktor's expression. Her eyes had something different now, a glow that mixed relief and something deeper, a silent admiration. He had put his own life at risk once again, and it didn't go unnoticed by her. Without saying anything, he just touched his hand gently. When Viktor returned to his seat, feeling the still pulsing heat of adrenaline on his skin, Viktor returned the look, not with words, but with a light squeeze of his hands. They didn't need to say anything. They both knew that they had overcome yet another challenge, and every additional moment on that flight meant that they were closer and closer to starting over. The pilot confirmed once again that the fuel system was working properly, but his voice on the radio carried a note of caution. He warned that any further structural damage could compromise the safety of the flight, and that they would need to carry out a forced landing if they encountered any further setbacks. Despite the tension, the aircraft was stable, and the warning lights on the dashboard no longer came on, indicating that they were out of immediate danger. Hours passed at a slow pace as fatigue began to take its toll on everyone on board. Viktor took advantage of the moment of calm to lean back in his seat and look at Kateryna, trying to find some indication of what she was feeling in her expressions. She noticed the look, and after a few seconds of silence, she let out a long sigh. He asked what they would do when they arrived, where they would go, and if they would really be able to build a new life without the past catching up with them. Viktor didn't hesitate. He said he still had contacts in the United States and could guarantee safety for both of them, at least long enough to get back on their feet. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he carried with him not only money and influence, but also the conviction that they had an advantage because they were already one step ahead of those who persecuted them. Kateryna, however, still felt restless. As much as he trusted Viktor's ability to find solutions, he had learned that security was never absolute, especially for someone who had made so many enemies. His gaze was lost for a few moments in the dark immensity of the sky outside, as he tried to imagine what it would be like to live without fear. Viktor noticed her hesitation and grabbed her hand, squeezing it firmly, wanting to convey that no matter what challenges came their way, they wouldn't be alone. He assured them he would find a way for them to rebuild their lives. Kateryna didn't respond right away, but when she finally did, her gaze no longer held just concern, but rather a spark of hope that she had long forgotten what it was like to feel. After exhausting hours of flight, the aircraft began its descent, and the city below emerged as a sea of lights amidst the darkness. The pilot reinforced the importance of maintaining discretion when disembarking, as there were cases of passengers being removed from the immigration queue for more rigorous checks, even on private flights. Kateryna instinctively squeezed Viktor's arm, feeling a chill run down her spine. They had overcome ambushes, escapes, and even a damaged plane, but the mere idea of being blocked at immigration made her feel in a way that everything could have been in vain. Viktor kept his expression firm, but his mind was already working on possible scenarios. He knew that the original documents they would receive were legitimate, but the recent date of issue could raise suspicions. He coldly calculated the risks and decided that remaining calm would be the only way to avoid problems. Still, a hint of tension remained there, silent, like a hidden weight on his conscience. Kateryna tried not to show her nervousness, but Viktor noticed her uneasiness. He held her hand, squeezing lightly, without looking away from the window. They needed to act naturally. Any hesitation, any stray glance could be interpreted as a warning sign to immigration agents. Kateryna took a deep breath and nodded slightly, trying to convince herself that this was just another step in the plan. The pilot's voice echoed in the cockpit, announcing that they had received clearance to land. The tension in the air was almost palpable. Passengers began to prepare themselves, seatbelts were fastened, and the landing gear was deployed. Viktor exchanged one last look with Kateryna, a brief moment, but full of meaning. There was no more room for doubt. They had come too far to fail now. The plane touched the runway smoothly, and the braking was accompanied by the absolute silence of the passengers. Everyone was practically waiting for some unexpected turn of events. The engines slowed down, and little by little, the sounds of the airport began to fill the environment. The pilot maneuvered to the designated gate, and while they waited for authorization to disembark in an area for private flights, Viktor maintained a rigid posture, closely observing any suspicious movement outside. Kateryna tried to control her breathing, but with each passing minute, the tension only increased. As soon as the release notice was given, they got up, picked up their few hand luggage, and headed for the exit door. The last obstacle was before them. Immigration was the line between the past and the future, and now, all that was left to do was cross it. The immigration queue moved quickly, as it was a private flight. Kateryna beside Viktor tried to keep her expression neutral, but tension was present in her rigid posture. He held her hand discreetly, an almost imperceptible gesture, but one that conveyed security. Then it was time for the two to go to the cabin. Kateryna went first. Viktor was another. The immigration agent took Kateryna's passport and began to examine it carefully, entering information into the system. Viktor kept his breathing controlled, observing the movements of the agent who was attending to Kateryna and the person who was assisting her. The delay was unusual, Kateryna felt her chest tighten when she noticed him furrowing his eyebrows and exchanging a quick glance with the colleague next to him who was holding Viktor's passport. The second agent approached, politely asking Kateryna to accompany him to a room for further inspection. He looked at Viktor and did the same. Then the two agents left their post to accompany Viktor and Kateryna. Following a narrow, not very busy corridor, Viktor quickly assessed the possibilities. Was it standard procedure, or had they been identified? Kateryna walked beside him without saying a word, but Viktor felt the tension in his breathing being held back. They were taken to a cold room, with white walls and no windows. The environment was almost clinical, lit only by a fluorescent bulb that flickered faintly from the ceiling. In the center of the room, a metal table and some chairs awaited them. The agents closed the door behind them, and the sound of the lock clicking echoed through the space, making the situation even more suffocating. Viktor remained calm, pulling out the chair and sitting down without hesitation, while Kateryna followed him, although her hands were cold and her gaze restless. At this moment, two other agents entered the room without showing any emotion, walking to the table with firm steps. One of them received Viktor and Kateryna's passports, while the other carried a bulky briefcase. They sat in front of the couple, spreading the documents on the metal table. The first agent opened the passports and leafed through them slowly, analyzing each detail carefully. His eyes fixed on Viktor's for a few seconds, waiting for a reaction. The other agent slid a folder to the center of the table and began leafing through the papers, his expressions remaining impassive, but the tension in the air was evident. Then came the first question. "Where were you before leaving for the United States?" asked one of the agents, without taking his eyes off the documents. Viktor realized that it was not a simple formality. The question was not asked to obtain information, but to confirm something they already knew. Without hesitation, he answered the truth. He said they spent the last few days in Poland, where they were trying to secure a safe way out of Europe because of the war. He explained that they could not trust commercial crossings, as they knew they could be banned from leaving the region. His voice remained firm, without any hesitation. Kateryna, beside him, remained silent, feeling her heart racing. The agent made a note, exchanging a discreet look with his colleague before continuing. The second agent rested his elbows on the table and asked the next question, while the first two agents who accompanied Viktor and Kateryna to the room sat further back observing the scene. "Do you have any relationship with the Russian government?" His tone was direct, incisive. Viktor took a deep breath before responding. "I knew lying wasn't an option." He said that in the past, he did have connections with government figures, as his fortune and business constantly put him in contact with these people. However, he stated that he never had any official position or direct involvement with state policies. He said his decision to flee was not only for safety, but also because he knew that at any moment, he could be used as a pawn in a scheme that would take him down dark paths. The agents remained silent for a moment, analyzing his words, and then one of them closed the folder, without revealing whether they were convinced or not. The other agent kept his gaze fixed on Viktor for a few moments, studying every slightest movement, evaluating any sign of hesitation. After flipping through the passport once more, he leaned back in his chair and asked in a casual but pointed manner, "So, if you are such an influential man, you must go on a lot of business trips," said the agent. Viktor replied yes, and the agent added, "And why were your documents generated recently?" The question hung in the air like a blade about to cut through any flaw in the answer. Viktor held his gaze and kept his voice steady, explaining that during the chaos in Ukraine, he lost his original documents while fleeing an area that had become dangerous. He said he needed to issue new ones as quickly as possible before leaving the country, as he knew he could not risk being left without identification. His voice was controlled, without signs of nervousness, but he noticed that the agent continued to analyze each word, looking for any contradiction. The silence in the room became heavy, suffocating. Kateryna clasped her hands in her lap, keeping her expression neutral, but feeling her heart race. The agents looked at each other, exchanging a look that Viktor couldn't fully interpret. The man holding the documents closed the folder slowly and stood up without saying anything. He opened the door and left the room, leaving only the other agent, who remained sitting in front of Viktor and Kateryna, and the two agents from the beginning sitting in the back. The expression of the agent at the table was impassive, cold, without showing any emotion. Time seemed to drag by, and Viktor knew that this pause was calculated to test their patience. He maintained a firm posture without looking away, while Kateryna tried to control her breathing so as not to show the tension she felt. The seconds stretched out, turning into minutes. The agent who remained in the room crossed his arms, watching the two in silence, without any clue of what was coming. Kateryna avoided looking at Viktor, afraid that any sudden movement could give rise to more suspicion. Then, without warning, the agent leaned forward slightly and let out a short sigh. The gesture was subtle, but it carried enormous weight. He hadn't yet decided what he would do next, and Viktor knew that any detail at that moment could seal their fate. The agent who had left returned holding a clear plastic envelope. Inside, Viktor could see the fake passports he and Kateryna had used to escape. The air became heavier, and the room seemed even smaller as the agent threw the envelope onto the table and lightly pushed it towards Viktor. The officer's gaze was sharp, attentive to any reaction. Kateryna subtly moved back in her chair, feeling the invisible threat in the air. Viktor, however, kept his expression controlled. He knew this moment could happen, but he had believed that the documents were far from them, discarded along the way. Now here they were, exposed as direct evidence against them. The agent leaned forward and crossed his arms once again. His voice sounded cold and meticulous as he asked, "Do you want to explain to us why they were carrying this?" The tension rose a level. Kateryna held her breath, avoiding looking at Viktor. He knew there was no point in making excuses. Any lie would only sink them further. Then, he faced the agent without hesitation and said firmly, "We needed this to escape the war zone. My real name is on the original passport, but if I tried to leave Ukraine with my real identity, I would never have succeeded." His words were precise, without tremors or deviations. He didn't ask for mercy, he just stated the facts as they were. The silence in the room lasted for a few more seconds as the agent absorbed the answer. The officer kept his gaze fixed on him, analyzing every detail, every pause in breathing, every small movement. Then he sat back in his chair and asked directly, "So you admit that you used false documents to cross borders?" Viktor nodded slowly and let out a short sigh before responding, "Yes, but not to commit crimes, to survive. My fortune and my name made me a target. If it weren't for that, I wouldn't be here now." The agent continued to stare at him, still evaluating his words. The truth was there, naked and raw, and now all that was left was to know if it would be enough to convince him. The agent looked at Kateryna, analyzing her expression carefully. She kept her hands clasped in her lap, her shoulders tense, and avoided looking directly at the officers in front of her. The uneasiness was evident, and Viktor realized he needed to remain calm for both of them. The agent then let out a long sigh, crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair before saying that they would better check who Viktor really was. If they were lying, nothing could prevent the harsh consequences that would befall them. The sentence was said with a neutral tone, but it carried a veiled threat. He did not seem convinced by the justification about the false documents, and this indicated that the situation could take an even more dangerous turn. The clock on the wall marked the slow passage of time. Viktor maintained a firm posture without showing impatience or discomfort. He knew they were testing his endurance, hoping a slip would give them away. Kateryna, on the other hand, remained motionless, her eyes fixed on an undefined point in the room. The silence dragged on like a suffocating shadow. The tension was a weapon being used against them, and Viktor knew it. He had been in difficult meetings before, negotiated deals with people who tried to measure his strength by how long he could endure the discomfort, but there it was different. The situation was not a business negotiation, but rather their freedom and security were at stake. After 2 hours without any information, the door finally opened. The agents returned, one of them holding a cell phone in his hand. His gaze was different, less inquisitive, and this made Viktor feel a change in the environment. The man stopped in front of him and said in a more restrained tone, "It seems like you have influential friends." The phrase carried a double meaning. Viktor knew someone intervened for him. The question was who and why. Kateryna looked up for the first time since they entered the room, waiting for an answer they didn't yet have. The agent placed the phone on the table and activated speakerphone. The voice of Viktor's advisor filled the room, calm and firm, explaining that Viktor was a respectable businessman and that there was no reason to detain him. Soon after, another voice appeared on the line, deeper and full of influence. He was someone powerful in the United States. That tone didn't ask, it determined. He assured that everything would be resolved and that Viktor should receive a formal apology for what happened. Kateryna, until then motionless, raised her head slightly, trying to understand the scale of what was happening. Viktor remained expressionless, but inside he knew that this changed everything. Whoever was on that line had enough power to directly interfere in the case. The agent listened in silence. He watched Viktor for a few seconds, as if trying to decipher something hidden behind that turn of events. Then he hung up the phone without saying anything. His gaze showed no surprise, just a resigned acceptance that the situation had gotten out of his hands. He slowly got up, took Viktor and Kateryna's documents and whispered something to the colleague next to him. Kateryna held her breath. The second agent nodded discreetly, remaining still as his partner left the room. Silence reigned again. It was impossible to tell whether this was a good sign or not. Viktor knew he had escaped difficult situations before, but this moment was different. He had no control over what would happen in the next few minutes. The seconds seemed to drag by. The agent who remained in the room sitting at the table did not make any movement. He just watched. Viktor stood his ground, but Kateryna felt the weight of uncertainty. Her body was tense. Her fingers were tightening the hem of her blouse without her realizing it. Finally, after a few minutes, the door opened again. The agent who had left returned, this time without the initial stiffness. He placed the passports on the table, analyzed Viktor for a moment longer, and in a milder tone, said, "Your fake passports will be retained here, and we will investigate to see if we find any fraud carried out with them. Your visa was, surprisingly, obtained quickly. Your advisor took care of the details. We will monitor your steps here. Anything suspicious we notice, you will be arrested and deported." The tone was firm, direct, leaving no room for argument. He paused briefly, as if expecting some reaction from Viktor or Kateryna, but the silence remained. He then sighed discreetly, leaned back in his chair, and almost reluctantly declared in an even more sober tone, in a way that seemed like he didn't mean to say those words, "Welcome to the United States." The phrase sounded less like a welcome and more like a warning. Viktor reached out, took the real passports, and stood up calmly without looking away from the agent. Kateryna followed his movement, feeling her legs wobble for a brief moment. Without saying anything else, they walked together to the door, leaving behind that cold room and the feeling that even though they were free, they were still being watched. Viktor felt his shoulders relax as he walked through the interrogation room door. The tension I had carried since takeoff seemed to finally begin to dissolve. Kateryna walked beside him, still unresponsive. The weight of uncertainty that had accompanied her throughout the trip gave way to a strange feeling of relief, but also of disbelief. The agents continued to watch as they continued down the hallway, still waiting for some reason to stop them. No words were spoken, just the rhythmic sound of their footsteps echoing in the room. When they passed through the last security check, Viktor felt the light touch of Kateryna's hand on his arm. It was a discreet gesture and full of meaning. As they walked through the exit doors, they were greeted by a blast of cold air. The city pulsed around them, alive, full of promise and possibility. The noise of cars, the lights of street signs, and the uninterrupted flow of people were a brutal contrast to the days of flight, fear, and uncertainty they had faced. Kateryna paused for a moment, closing her eyes for a brief moment, taking in everything around her. When he opened his eyes again, he met Viktor's gaze. He was watching her with an expression she had never seen before. That different feeling was there, something that wasn't just relief, but a kind of clarity he hadn't known before. "We did it," she said, her voice choked with a mixture of emotion and exhaustion. Viktor looked away at the skyscrapers in front of him, taking a deep breath. Everything he had lost, everything he had left behind, now seemed like a distant chapter. For the first time, he didn't see his future as just a never-ending quest for power and control. With Kateryna by his side, his newfound freedom and chance to start over showed him something he had never considered: real purpose. His advisor, always efficient, had already taken steps to ensure that his new life began without difficulties. Transfers had been made, money in secure accounts, part in dollars and part in cryptocurrencies. Viktor had resources, he had security, but above all, he had the opportunity to be more than what the world expected of him. As he looked at Kateryna again, he knew that this was the only wealth that truly mattered. Viktor and Kateryna walked in silence, crossing the busy street, blending into the anonymous crowd that filled the city. The sound of horns, voices in different languages, and the fast pace of the metropolis seemed like a parallel universe to what they had experienced in the last few months. No chase, no shooting, no lurking army, just firm steps towards the unknown, carrying the promise of a fresh start. Viktor's attentive gaze roamed the people around him, registering the details and expressions. Kateryna, in turn, hugged her coat to her body, still assimilating the fact that they were free. In the distance, skyscrapers gleamed in the city light, a silent reminder that everything was yet to be built. The immensity of the place appears more imposing with the rays of the sun, revealing the grandeur of the city as Viktor and Kateryna disappear in the flow of unknown faces. The weight of the past still accompanied them, but there was something new there, the possibility of a better future. They still didn't know what their next step would be, but one thing was undeniable: the obstacles, the risk taken. Each decision made had brought them here. The silence between them was not one of apprehension, but of mutual understanding. After so long, they finally didn't need to run. They didn't need to look back. Everything indicated that finally, a peaceful and safe future awaited them in this new land. In the midst of all that feeling of freedom and renewal, destiny, relentless, would still not grant them rest. Viktor's phone vibrated in his coat pocket, a subtle sound but one that sent a shiver down his spine. When he answered, his advisor's voice came urgently, interrupted by rapid breathing and the distant noise of hurried footsteps and slamming doors. The words came quickly, overwhelmed by despair. The Russian army had taken over the building of Viktor's main company, the one that managed all his business, and was searching everything, rummaging through documents, confiscating servers, looking for any trace that could link him to anything compromising. That action was not just a simple search, it was a bloodthirsty and merciless hunt for a possible traitor to the state. The air around Viktor seemed to grow thicker, with the sound of the city drowned out by the intense beating of his own heart. His eyes moved instinctively, analyzing the faces and movements around him. The advisor's final warning came as a blunt blow. They were coming, closer and closer. He ended by saying he would return as soon as possible. Thus the phone was abruptly turned off, leaving only the terrifying silence of an invisible threat about to reach him. Standing on the sidewalk, Viktor felt the weight of that revelation crush any illusion of safety. Kateryna, noticing the change in his expression, approached, trying to understand what had happened. Viktor looked at her, his gaze lost between concern and the need to act, and that feeling only had one meaning. The game wasn't over yet. Viktor and Kateryna's journey has reached another turning point, but what does fate have in store for them? Will they finally find the peace they so desire to live the love that was born in the midst of chaos? Or will new challenges prevent them from having that chance? Share your theories in the comments, and tell us your best guess for the next steps for this couple who defied the impossible. If you liked the miniseries, follow the channel, and turn on notifications to follow more engaging stories like this. And if you want to know what will happen from here, leave in the comments your desire for a new season full of action, surprises and twists of this surprising series, Contrast. Thank you so much for watching and see you next season.